Well, hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us, the Traverse Area District Library Zoom programming. You can find all of our events at tattle.org/events. And then a lot of our events, especially hybrid or via Zoom, are usually recorded, and you can find them later again on our Tattle Not Just Books, which is the handle for our YouTube channel. Tonight we have Heather Bruegl. We had her back here. We spoke with her back in March in Women's History Month when she spoke about the power of Native women. And I just felt that what she brings to the table is so powerful and relevant that we thought for sure she needed to come back during this month in November, which is National Native American History Month. She is an educator, an historian, a curator, I believe, an activist, and she is a impassioned speaker, and especially she is a powerful voice for Indigenous people, and we are so thankful you are here today to talk to us about this subject. Thank you very much, Heather, for coming.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be able to do this. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so I don't forget. Okay, great. So yeah, I'm super excited to be talking to you today during Native American Heritage Month, which is always the month of November, and really excited that maybe you're going to leave here today learning something that you didn't know before, and possibly passing that information along. And so I'm really honored to be able to do that. I do want to do just a couple of disclaimers before we get started. Number one, I live downtown Detroit, and sometimes it can be noisy, and my desk is right by our window, and so if you hear sirens, that's because the city is loud. So just wanted to make that disclaimer. The second is that we're talking about contemporary histories and issues in Indian country. And so some of them can be quite difficult. We're going to touch on boarding schools. We're going to touch on missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so if you feel triggered in any way, shape, or form, I want you to take, a time out, step away, take a moment for yourself. If you're able to come back, please do so. If you can't, that's okay as well. This is being recorded, so maybe you can come back and listen later, but your mental well-being is super important to me. So I just want to give those warnings that, we will be talking about some pretty hard things this evening. But this is titled, We're Still Here, We Are Still Here, Contemporary Histories and Issues in Indian Country. So while we're going to the concept of the talk, the reason the talk is called this is because even though I'm talking about some hard histories, we're still here. We're combating these issues. Even though some of these issues are something that are still here today, we are resilient and we're working through them and we're coming out on the other side. So I just want to make sure that that you're aware of that. And let's see. I'm gonna stop sharing and reshare again because I was getting a weird bar on my share screen. So there we go. Okay. So why is this doing this again? Okay. All right. So with that being said, oh, and of course we'll have time for Q&A at the end. You can utilize the Q&A function on the webinar, and we'll get to your questions at the end. So the first is I want to acknowledge the land that we're on. Specifically, this is the land that I am on. So I like to acknowledge the Peoria, Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, Miami, Wyandotte, and Fox nations that called Detroit, Michigan home. The Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi's people lived throughout all of Michigan, but I specifically want to acknowledge the Detroit part because that's where I live. So we acknowledge that through forced land cessions and removal, these nations were removed from the lands that they called home, and their seats of government are now in Canada, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and other parts of Michigan. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present. We understand that this acknowledgement is just the first step in building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. I think it's important that we always acknowledge the land that we're on, that we understand that the land that we are on, we are just stewards of it, right? It doesn't belong to us. We don't own it. There's not this concept of land owning in Indigenous cultures. We're stewarding it for the next 7 generations. And then I just wanted to also point out that the picture on this slide actually is not even from Michigan, but it's related to my ancestry. And this is from the river that's right in front of my uncle's cabin on the reservation that he grew up on in Wisconsin. So it's just a really special place for me, and I just wanted to share a little piece of it with you. My husband actually took the photo. He's a photographer, and so he likes to capture these little moments, and I think they're quite beautiful. A little bit more about me. My name is Heather. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. I'm a first-line descendant, Stockbridge Munsee. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I work as a historian, Indigenous consultant, a curator, a lecturer. Like I don't fit into one box. I do a lot of different things. My contact information is on the screen here. So maybe you think of a question later and you didn't ask during this, but you want to get an answer to it. Go ahead, shoot me an email. Maybe you want me to come to your facility. Shoot me an email. So the Gmail is on there. I do have a Twitter or X, as it's called now. I'm not super active on it. If you want to follow me on social media, I recommend you follow me on Instagram. You can also message me on that as well. And then my website, heatherbruegl.com, where it lists everything that I do, all the work that I do, and upcoming events. So if you like this event tonight and you want to know where I'm at next, you can follow my website. It's November, so I'm quite busy. There's a couple of opportunities to see me, and I always list on my website whether the event is in person or if it's virtual, or if it's both. That way you are able to tune in. So I want to start off tonight's talk by talking about the indigenous population of what we now call the United States. So in 1300, it's estimated that there are around 10 million indigenous peoples here. By 1900, that number drops to just under 240,000. That is a huge drop, massive drop. Why is that? There were a number of things that led up to that, and some of those things we're actually going to discuss this evening, including boarding schools, including disease, war, things like that. So a lot of that led to the huge decline in population. By 1990, the population was just under 2 million. By 2013, our population was around 5.2 million. And in 2020, our population was around 6.79 million. While our numbers did go back up, it's important to point out that the total population of Indigenous people in the United States only makes up 2% of the population. So a continent that was once stewarded by Indigenous people, where we had villages and towns that rivaled some of the most magnificent cities in Europe, we only now make up 2% of that population. And I think that's really important to talk about and to take note of that. I also wanted to show you this map. It moves, so you aren't seeing things. It's totally changing while it's on the screen. I got this map from the Library of Congress, and you're able to find it there if you wanted to. But I wanted to talk about this map because what I like about it is it shows the land cessions that were made by Indigenous peoples throughout history, right? So it goes every decade or so into present day and talks about the land loss from Indigenous people. So you see when it starts out just after the 13 colonies in the United States was founded. And you'll see that the eastern seaboard's pretty darn empty, right? There's not a lot of Indigenous tribes, if any, listed in that area. And that's because my ancestors included some of our first contact happened in the early 1600s. And so we were moved out of our homelands very, very early on. And as westward expansion happens, as we have that concept of manifest destiny, Indigenous people keep getting pushed further westward until eventually we end up on the reservations that we have today. Obviously, the largest reservation in the United States is the Navajo Reservation, located in the Four Corners region of the United States. But even the reservation land that we have today is also only 2% of the land population. If you took all the reservation land that we have today across the United States, it would all fit in the state of Idaho. That's it. Um, but at one point, and you can see, we had the entire continent. We had the entirety of what is now called the United States. We stewarded it for centuries. It was our home. We had families, tribal governments, and all of that. And it's important. You to have this visual representation of what the United States looked like prior to colonization, because it's important. A lot of these policies that were put in place by the United States government were about land. Land is at the center of everything because land equals wealth. And so it's important to note that, because the things that we talk about tonight, even when I'm talking about boarding schools, the purpose of boarding schools was to get more land. So just keep that in mind as we're going through. And again, you can find this map, the Library of Congress. I don't remember what my search terms were, but you can find it at the Library of Congress. So I want us to just think about this phrase for a moment. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. And the reason I want us to think about this is because this was the policy of the federal government for a very, very, very long time. This is how they dealt with, quote, the Indian problem, is the only good Indian is a dead Indian. It was about wiping out an entire group of people. It was about erasing an entire group of people. And that is really hard. That's really hard to think about. It's not that I ever forget that I'm Indigenous, but I live in a world now where, Indigenous people exist. We're here, right? And I sometimes forget that there was a time in our history where the thought process around was to get rid of us. And I can't imagine what it would have been like to live during a time period where people didn't want you here, right? Indigenous people specifically. And that's very hard to fathom, to think about, and so it's important that we know that this policy, this word was a policy that the federal government had for a very long time, that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Well, unlucky for them, we're still here, right? We have survived a number of things. And so we're going to talk about some of those things tonight. I first wanted to start off by talking about the American Indian movement, because I think it was part of the civil rights movement, but I don't think it's one that we talk about a lot. It kind of gets forgotten about a little bit. And the American Indian movement was really cool. It was something that was really awesome. So if you'll notice that, the letters in it spell AIM, that was done on purpose, right? Because there was a goal, they were aiming for something. So AIM was formed in Minneapolis, Minnesota in July of 1968. Founders included Dennis Banks, Clyde Bellecourt, and later on Russell Means. More than 200 Indigenous people got together in order to discuss the issues that they faced. Now, this was primarily a group of Indigenous people that were living in urban settings, so in the cities, not on reservations. Not that that wasn't important, but right for this, AIM was starting out focusing on the plight of the urban Indigenous person. So they wanted to address issues within the Indigenous community, such as sovereignty, treaty issues, education, racism, and yes, police brutality. The group was founded to help the plight of the urban Indian, as I stated earlier, who were forced to leave reservations due to termination. There was a loss of culture and the loss of self, and there was also extreme poverty amongst those people living in the urban settings. But what AIM was really good at doing, what they were really amazing at doing, was organizing mass protests across the country to raise awareness to issues that were in Indian country. And the reason I say that they were very good at doing this is because they organized a number, and briefly touch on some of them, but they were also good at using the media to get their causes in mainstream news and to get their point across. So that's what they were really, really good at. And so, AIM is something, AIM like we knew it in the 1960s and 70s isn't around anymore, but there are small chapters of AIM in different states where this work is still being done. And so I just want to briefly touch on some of their work, some of that you may have known. So the first is the occupation at Alcatraz, which started in 1969. The prison, Alcatraz was a prison beforehand. It closed in 1963. And since then, the Bay Area natives in San Francisco had been lobbying for a cultural center and a school to be placed on the island. In October of 1969, a fire burnt down San Francisco's American Indian Center. A group by the name of Indians of All Tribes then decided that Alcatraz needed to be a place of organization and occupation. So one of the main leaders of this occupation was Richard Oakes, who was a Mohawk Indian, said, quote, "If a one-day occupation by white men on Indian land years ago established squatter rights, then a one-day occupation of Alcatraz should establish Indian rights to the island." So kind of using that same logic that the colonists were first using when they came over. So on the night of November 20th, and that anniversary is coming up, a group of 89 indigenous people set sail to Alcatraz and claimed it for all tribes. They demanded that the federal government provide funds to create a university and a cultural center. They made personal touches by adding graffiti, red power, peace, freedom, and welcome, and one of my personal favorites, Custer had it coming. The indigenous people claimed Alcatraz by the right of discovery, the same way some of the first lands were claimed here in the United States. They issued their intentions of wanting to build a school and a cultural center and a museum. They did offer to buy the island, though, for $24 in glass beads and some red cloth, which is the same amount that is said were paid to the Lenape people for the island of Manhattan. Nixon was president at this time. The US government didn't accept that offer, by the way. But Nixon was president at the time. There were a lot of things happening in 1969 in the United States. You had Vietnam. You also had Vietnam protests. So they wanted the protests to remain peaceful. They didn't want to get involved in any way, shape, or form. The population on the island at one point grew to 600 people. They created their own police force called the Bureau of Caucasian Affairs. A Lakota man by the name of John Trudell, who's one of my personal heroes, joined and broadcasted under the radio banner of Radio Free Alcatraz. By 1970, though, the dynamic on the island started to change. A lot of the activists who first started out there had to leave. A lot of them were college students, so they had to leave and go back to school. The federal government decided that the occupation wasn't going to end diplomatically, so they cited the need to fix a lighthouse. They came onto the island. They eventually ended the occupation on June 11th, 1971. It ends in 1971. It started in 1969, so it went on for a while. Not a lot changed for Indigenous people after that. But what did change is the fact that non-Native people knew about some of the issues in Indian country. And so that leads to other things going on. So we've got the occupation of Wounded Knee, which happened in Wounded Knee, South Dakota, on the Pine Ridge Reservation, where we had AIM come in and work with traditional Lakota leaders and formed an occupation around treaty rights and land rights, and also wanting to help bring an end to some of the corruption that was happening on the reservation. Their chairperson at the time, Dick Wilson, was not the most up and up person. And so they, a lot of the traditional Lakota people living in Pine Ridge at the time wanted him out of office. And so there were impeachment hearings and things like that. But it really did bring awareness to some issues. And the reason this is significant is because it happened at Wounded Knee. And if you're familiar with Wounded Knee, the first time you hear about it is in 1890, when there is a massacre that happens of around 300 unarmed Lakota women, children, and elders by the 7th Cavalry, which is kind of in retaliation for the 7th Cavalry's defeat in the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. So this, Wounded Knee was sacred ground. After, during that same time, you've got the Trail of Broken Treaties, which ends up being a caravan that goes from California all the way to Washington, D.C., which was organized also around inadequate housing standards, living standards, and of course, broken treaties. There were 8 organizations that sponsored the Trail of Broken Treaties, including the American Indian Movement. As the caravan went across the country, it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I am lucky enough to know some of those OG activists who were part of the Trail of Broken Treaties. They got to Washington, D.C. They didn't have places to stay because places that they were going to stay had kind of revoked their permission to allow these activists to stay there. So what ends up happening is they take over the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is kind of an eyesight of the White House. And so it was like, no, you're going to hear our demands. So they put together a 20-point paper to give to the Nixon administration, and it talks about some of their demands, which were the enforcement of treaties. It's important to note that the United States has never once completely honored a treaty that they've made with an indigenous nation. They were there for about a week. The Nixon administration promised to include them in future treaty negotiations. One of the largest treaties that they cited that had been broken time and time again was the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. So that's really kind of important to note. And then you had other smaller occupations, like the occupation of Mount Rushmore, which is located in the Black Hills, which is considered sacred to the Lakota people. Before it was Mount Rushmore, it was the Six Grandfathers, which was a sacred place. You also, I don't have it listed on here, but then we also have protests at Plymouth Rock and other smaller locations. And the protests at Plymouth Rock ended up morphing into what we call the National Day of Mourning, which happens on Thanksgiving every year. There is still a gathering there every year without fail. And so AIM was really, really instrumental in making sure that people, to quote Wilma Mankiller, who was principal chief of Cherokee Nation during her lifetime, Indians had rights, and AIM was going to make sure everybody knew about it. And that's something I think that we continue to carry through with us today. And the reason for AIM, there was a reason for AIM. There were policies that were put in place that were there to harm Indigenous people. And so AIM was in reaction to some of those policies. And one of those policies was boarding schools. And so again, I'm just going to put this out there. If you are triggered in any way, shape, or form by the next couple topics, do please step away and take a moment for yourself, because I do want to make sure that you're okay. In the mid-late 1800s and early 1900s, the boarding school era was in full swing. Boarding schools were set up to take Native children from their homes and their families and charter them off to schools far away from anything they knew and to assimilate them. Boarding schools were not close. They were in very remote locations, usually in open locations. So if you ran, there was nowhere to run. These schools were government and religious society funded. Children were forcibly taken out of their home, and when they arrived at the school, their hair was cut, their names were changed, and their language was stripped from them. Oftentimes, there was physical, mental, and sexual abuse that happened at these schools. When a child had completed their schooling, more often than not, they found that they didn't belong anywhere. You didn't fit back home on your reservation because you had left. You had been forced to leave and give up your ways. So you didn't understand what was happening anymore. But at the end of the day, you were still an Indian, so you didn't belong in the white world either. You had this loss of identity and this loss of self. And so that is something that is really kind of sad to think about. I will very openly say that I'm the granddaughter and great-granddaughter of boarding school survivors. And so I very firmly believe that they survived so that I could thrive and make sure that these stories continuously get out and that we're still continuously talking about them. But the harm and assimilation with the children didn't stop at boarding schools. We also then had something called the Indian Adoption Project. And as the boarding school era was winding down, most schools officially closed as Indian boarding schools by the 1970s, 1980s. In Canada, the residential schools closed as late as the late 1990s. So these schools were around for a really long time. After they were closed and no longer operated as boarding schools, there were new ways of separating children from their families. In 1958, the Indian Adoption Project was launched, and it ran until 1967. They were aided by the prestigious Indian Child Welfare League of North America, which was the predecessor to the Adoption Resource Exchange of North America. And they functioned from 1966 until the early 1970s. Many religious organizations were involved as well, and I think that's important to note. This is not talking, bad about if you're a religious person, your religion at all. To each their own, but religious organizations were involved in this. In fact, in Canada, about 90% of boarding schools or residential schools were run by the Catholic Church. I grew up Catholic, so this is not you know, anything negative about the Catholic Church, or if you're Catholic, you should feel bad. Absolutely not. But it's a fact that we have to reckon with. And so not only the Catholic Church, but the Mormon Church played big roles in this adoption project as well. In fact, the Mormon Church took thousands of Navajo children and adopted them out to Mormon homes to mainly work on Mormon farms. So it was adopting out farm labor. And the Catholic Church, who ran many boarding schools, would take the children that were in their schools and foster and adopt them out to non-Native families and not tell the Native family. So when the end of the school year came, and children were able to, or not the end of the school year, but when your schooling was done and you were able to leave, many families wondered where their children were. And so they would be told stories, they would be told lies, but in reality, number one, they may have passed away while at school, or secondly, it's because they were adopted out and the family just didn't know about it. The Indian Adoption Project was something that was funded through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the BIA, is under the Department of the Interior, and it oversees Indian affairs. So this was a project that fell into their purview. Now, we usually think of the BIA as something that is there for Indigenous people, something there to help, but it wasn't always the case. So that's also important to note. Again, the purpose of this government-funded program was assimilation. That is the goal with any policy that the US federal government had towards Native nations. Assimilation as the goal was the only way to get rid of, quote, the Indian problem. Most of the time, removal was unneeded and caused more harm than good. From interviews that have been read while doing research on this, 2 children had been taken from from after being in the hospital. One had a rash and one suffered from tuberculosis. Another adoptee recalled that they were taken after their father died and their mother didn't want to give them up. And yet another recalled that they were taken because their grandfather was a traditional medicine man and refused to give up traditional ways. And that's just a few stories. There were also no home studies that were done to warrant children being taken from their home. They were just taken. The way to change a nation or to get rid of a nation is to start with its children. Once you start with the children and you assimilate them or you get them out of what they know as familiar, it starts to change their ways. And then a civilization changes as well. Why is that? Why did they want to do that? As long as there's Native nations around, treaties have to be honored. If the Native nation isn't around, you don't have to honor that treaty anymore. So because of this, we had something called the Indian Child Welfare Act that was introduced. also known as ICWA. So if you hear me say ICWA, I'm talking about the Indian Child Welfare Act. So seeing what was happening in Native nations actually reporting their children missing, something had to be done. The Association on American Indian Affairs, which is one of the oldest advocacy groups in the United States, did a survey. And they found that children were being removed at alarming rates. And they also were finding that tribal leaders were literally reporting their children missing. They were filling out missing person reports because they had no clue where their kids were. So, in response to this, Congress enacted something called the Indian Child Welfare Act. ICWA was looked at as a way to best protect the interests of Native children and promote stability and security of Native nations. In the process of looking through why this was happening, Congress identified 4 reasons that Native children were being removed. The first was lack of culturally competent state child welfare standards for accessing fitness of Indian families, meaning that non-Native social workers didn't understand Indigenous culture and didn't make an attempt to. So something that may have been absolutely normal in Indigenous culture, a non-Native social worker would look at it as something wrong. The second was systematic due process violations against Native children and their parents in custody hearings, meaning parents, family members, and tribes were not being notified of court dates. So they didn't know when to show up. Number 3, economic incentives favoring the removal of children, meaning the government, mainly the Bureau of Indian Affairs, was literally paying social workers to remove Indigenous children. And 4, social conditions in Indian country. They were poor and underfunded communities. So on the outside, reservations didn't look like good places to live, even though children were surrounded by community. That phrase, "it takes a village," literally happens on reservations. Everyone's raising your baby, not just you. So in 1978, against actual opposition from church groups, several states, and some social welfare groups, President Jimmy Carter signs ICWA. ICWA sets the minimum federal standards for nearly all Native children in custody proceedings. This includes adoption, voluntary and involuntary termination of parental rights, and removal and foster placement of children. ICWA also provides states have no jurisdiction over adoption or custody hearings of Native children residing on reservations. ICWA was also there to help families and tribes address a long list of atrocities that had been committed over the years. And when placing children, now caseworkers have to consider 4 things: providing active efforts to the family, identifying placement that falls under the qualifications laid out in ICWA, notifying the child's tribe and parents when custody hearings are, and working actively to involve the child's tribe and parents in court proceedings. Those seem like very simple things, but we had to have it put on paper so that it would actually happen. And because of the protections that have been added, ICWA has been looked at as the highest standard in placing children into the system and then placing them into Native homes. It's the gold standard of child placement. It also sets for the unique relationship that tribal nations have within the United States. Native people are not classified by race, but rather as political entities because they are part of sovereign nations that are recognized by the United States. Native nations should have a say in what happens to their children. So, in other words, because I'm an Indigenous person, being Indigenous or being Indian or being Native American, that's not my race. I am a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, which means I am a citizen of a sovereign nation, which means I am a political entity, right? So that's important to note because one of the contemporary issues that we have today were challenges to ICWA, and we just overcame a big one, like this year, 2023. So in recent years, there have been a number of threats to ICWA and its constitutionality. If you're familiar with the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, whatever you want to call it, how many times it's been challenged? It's been challenged a lot. ICWA has been challenged more. ICWA has been challenged more than the Affordable Care Act. And just this past in November, so just the past Supreme Court term, there was a case regarding ICWA going to the Supreme Court. It was brought by the state of Texas asking that ICWA should be thrown out. Those challenging it said that ICWA is unconstitutionally race-based and gives too much power to tribes over states. Now, we just said Indigenous people are not a race, they're a political entity, and because we're citizens of sovereign nations who should be able to get a say over what happens to their children. This challenge to ICWA questions that, says it's not right, says tribal nations have no right to tell states what they can do. So in addition to Texas, Louisiana, and Indiana also joined. And the other people in the case were a couple of non-native couples. So the case was called Brackeen v. Holland. In 2018, a federal court in Texas, in a decision that was widely criticized, said that ICWA violated the Constitution. It argued that if ICWA is thrown out, it would decimate Native families, threaten tribal sovereignty, and tear apart communities. The case involved Chad and Jennifer Brackeen, a non-native couple, and a young Navajo boy that the couple wanted to adopt. The young boy was placed in their care when he was 10 months old to foster, and they were told from the beginning that they were not going to be able to adopt him. The placement center that placed him didn't have a native foster family at the time, but they were looking for a native family to adopt him. So they said, can you please, take him into your home until we find a native family? So when a Navajo couple was found to adopt the young boy, the Brackeens decided that they were going to fight that. They won their case in the state and ended up adopting the young boy. They then later file a case saying that ICWA discriminated against them on the basis of race. And later they filed a petition to adopt the young boy's younger sister, who was born later, and the Brackeens never even fostered. So they approached the Native mother about adopting a daughter that hadn't even been born yet. And they said, oh, well, we'll take her too. So kind of really going about and doing what ICWA was there to prevent from happening. So the Brackeen's lawyer argued that the preferences that ICWA gives to Native parents discriminates against non-Native parents on the basis of race. This claim contradicts the central underlying premise of federal Indian law: tribal affiliation is political, not racial. This brings in the difficult and complex relationship between Native nations and the federal government. And I also people always say too, well, because non-Native people are put at the bottom of the list, that is where they felt discriminated against. But I will also tell you something if I'm Oneida, I would also not be given preferential treatment to adopt a Navajo boy or Navajo child because I'm Indigenous. I'm not Navajo. So I even fall low on that list as well. Would I get a Native child before a non-Native couple? I would, if there was nowhere else for this child to go. If they weren't able to find family to take the child, if they weren't able to find another Navajo couple to take the child, then it gets opened up to other Native people. But that doesn't put me number one on the list just because I am, Native person. So it's really important that we understand that how ICWA is there to prevent, Native families from being torn apart like they were during the boarding school era. In June of 2023, this year, the Supreme Court issued their decision and they upheld ICWA, which was a shock to all of us in Indian country, considering how the makeup of the court is. But they basically said that the state of Texas and the Brackeens didn't have standing, which means they really didn't have a right to bring the case. But they also then kind of left the door open for it to maybe be challenged again. So we are understanding that there are some things, that are important, and that the Supreme Court did stand up for Native nations during that time. Um, Again, I want to also give a warning because I am going to touch on missing and murdered Indigenous women during this next part, because this is a contemporary history and a contemporary issue that we face a lot. So if you do have to step away, again, please do so. So I first want to start by talking about Gabby Petito, and people are always like, why are you talking about Gabby Petito when you're talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women? It'll come together, I promise. So just to familiarize yourself again, if you have forgotten or maybe don't quite remember who Gabby Petito was. In July of 2021, Gabby and her fiance, Brian, left New York on a cross-country van trip. On August 12th, there was a disorderly conduct stop after someone spotted the couple and called the police. On August 25th, Gabby made her last post to Instagram. And the van is spotted in the Grand Teton National Park. A couple of days later, Gabby's mother is getting reports about suspicious text messages from her. There were numerous claims of maybe seeing hitchhikers, maybe seeing Gabby walking down the road, but none of them turned out to be true. On September 1st, Brian returned to Florida without Gabby. On September 11th, Gabby was reported missing. On September 15th, Brian is named a person of interest. And on September 19th, Gabby's remains are found. This was only 8 days after being reported missing. A couple of days, on August 21st, the remains of Brian were found. The case is tragic as it resulted in the death of a young girl. But let me say one more time that from the time that she was reported missing until the time that she was found was only 8 days. It was 8 days. Why is that? Why was it only 8 days from report to recovery? When Gabby went missing, it wasn't just her family that was looking for her. The whole nation felt the loss. She was everywhere. She was on the news, morning, noon, and night. She was on your social media feed. You couldn't look anywhere and not hear anything about Gabby. Again, she was everywhere. There's this concept called missing white woman syndrome. And this was coined in 2004 by the late journalist Gwen Ifill, who worked at PBS NewsHour. It basically means a hunger for stories about victims who look a certain way at the exclusion of all others. Young, white, blonde, etc. The missing white woman holds a lot of symbolic weight in the American psyche. It's historical. From the moment we think about the lost colony in Roanoke, way back when, we think about the little girl named Virginia Dare and what happened to her, what happened to this colony. But in the same breath, around the same time period, you also have the story of Pocahontas, who was 10 years old when she enters your textbooks. But by popular portrayals, you wouldn't know that. There is a romance that is mythologized between her and John Smith, who would have been 27 at the time. But that never happened. He never mentions the alleged relationship when he gives accounts of his time being held by the Powhatan Confederacy. There's no defiance on the side of Pocahontas to bring John Smith and other colonists food. In fact, Pocahontas' father said, the colonists are starving, they don't know what they're doing, let's bring them food. But John Smith's able to get away with this story, and no one ever questions it. If you think in the 1920s with the film release Birth of a Nation, it's white women who are shown to be the possible victims of formerly enslaved men, when a majority of the time it was formerly enslaved Black women who were the victims of white men. Missing white woman syndrome is historical, as they've always been portrayed as victims. In the same area where Gabby's remains were found, same area, 710 Indigenous women had been reported missing between 2011 and 2020. 710. But we don't know their names. But we know Gabby's name. Some statistics that we do know involving missing and murdered Indigenous women and peoples, because I do want to make emphasis that we do have Indigenous men who go missing, and our Indigenous two-spirited and trans brothers and sisters also go missing as well. Most of these statistics are funded and found out by Indigenous-run organizations because at the federal level, they don't do anything. So more than 4 in 5 Native women experience violence. More than 1 in 2 have experienced sexual violence. Alaskan Native women experience a higher rate of sexual assault and higher reported rates of domestic violence. On some reservations, women are murdered at a rate that is 10 times higher than the national average. Many times, the assailant is a non-Native person. There are no firm statistics on missing and murdered Indigenous women, and the lack of response is alarming. There's a lack of law enforcement, and many of the time, these crimes don't even get investigated. Between 2005 and 2009, the U.S. attorneys declined to prosecute 67% of Indian country matters that involved sexual abuse and related matters. They just flat out declined to prosecute them at all. We do have some legislation that hopefully is going to help. We have Savannah's Act, which was signed into law in October of 2020. It's named for Savannah LaFontaine Greywind, who went missing and was later murdered. Her perpetrators were brought to justice. But this Savannah's Act aims to increase communication between federal, state, and tribal and local authority data collection. We need to collect the data. We also have the Not Invisible Act, which was signed into law in October of 2020. It is intended to, quote, increase intergovernmental coordination to identify and combat violent crime within Indian lands and of Indians. So basically making the Department of the Interior, the Department of Justice, all these intergovernment agencies work together, right? We do have the Survive Act, which has not been passed yet. This act would specifically set aside funds that can only be used by Native nations to help survivors of sexual and domestic abuse get back on their feet. But policy is not a one-size-fits-all. Many times, more often than not, policy is created without women of color, especially Native women, in mind or at the table. They are left out of the discussion even though they suffer higher rates of violence. Policy has to be created with women of color at the center of it. It has to be taken into consideration that Native women not only deal with physical violence, but also bureaucratic violence from the state. Violence from state politics, as well as violence from within the communities, needs to be addressed at the same time together, not separately. And the community needs to be involved in order to help solve this problem. And so finally, the last thing I want to talk to you about tonight before we move to Q&A is the Land Back movement. Land Back, as we know it today, was launched on Indigenous Peoples Day in 2020. And this is also an answer to policies in the past that took land away. So the Land Back movement is an effort to dismantle white supremacy and achieve justice for Indigenous peoples. The movement came on the heels of the land defenders who on July 3rd, 2020, were able to block traffic to a Trump rally that was happening in the Black Hills. In the middle of the pandemic, the former president held a rally. We had land defenders who were the Lakota people and other people, tribal people in the area who call that area home, bringing awareness to this, that the Black Hills, and you can look more into that on your own. I do have a whole other talk that talks about that, how they were illegally taken. The Black Hills were illegally taken from the Lakota people, violating the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. You had counter protests who were yelling at the land defenders to, tell them to shut up and go back to where you came from, and all these ridiculous things, when the Lakota people were like, this is where we came from. Like, this is the land that birthed us. And so they were also bringing awareness to Mount Rushmore. And so one of the things is to close down Mount Rushmore and return all public lands in the Black Hills to Indigenous peoples. A lot of people are like, why Mount Rushmore? What's wrong with that? Well, Mount Rushmore is supposed to be this shrine to democracy, when in fact it's probably one of the greatest monuments to white supremacy that we have. Those 4 faces of those 4 men carved on that mountain we're not the greatest people in the world towards people of color and indigenous people, but yet you have the faces basically desecrating the sacred mountain, which was known as the Six Grandfathers prior to. So there are four campaign demands that Land Back has, and that's to dismantle white supremacy structures that forcefully removed us from our lands and continue to keep our people in oppression. And this includes the Bureau of Land Management and the National Park Service. Not to close the national parks, but maybe return the stewardship of the national parks to the original caretakers, which would be the indigenous people. The second is to defund white supremacy and the mechanisms and systems that enforce it and disconnect us from stewardship of the land. This would include the police, the military industrial complex, border patrol, and ICE. People often are like, why border patrol and ICE? Tribal reservations, there's a number of them, cross colonial borders. And when you're crossing colonial borders, we can understand that sometimes if you're a person of color, getting back across the border can be difficult. And this concept of having colonial borders stops us really from being able to freely move across our land. So the third is to return unequivocally all public lands into Indigenous hands. We're not going for the land that your house is sitting on. We're going for public lands that were illegally taken from Indigenous peoples. And the fourth is consent, moving us out of an era of consultation and into a new era of policy around free and prior informed consent. Consultation doesn't work. Consultation comes to the table and says, we've got this project that we've already approved. It's going to maybe be on some of your land or around some of your sacred sites. That's okay. What can we do to make it better? So consultation already has decided on a project and now just wants a solution. Where free and prior informed consent involves Indigenous people from the start and gives us the ability to have a say in what's going to happen. Consultation was used during the Dakota Access Pipeline. It didn't work. If we had had free and prior informed consent, not saying that the pipeline should have been built in the first place, there would have been more conversation around it instead of the Army Corps of Engineers just starting to dig through sacred burial mounds. So free and prior informed consent works better than consultation. If you want to do more reading, or maybe you like to watch documentary, I would like to recommend the following. An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, Lakota Woman, are both books that I think are absolutely wonderful. You can get them at your local library or from your local independent bookstore if you want to buy them and own them. Murder in Bighorn is a documentary that you can stream on Showtime or Amazon that talks about the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. It just came out last year, so it's very current, it's very new. You can stream it online. And Bighorn, they're talking about Bighorn County, Montana, which is kind of the epicenter of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the United States. Landback.org talks obviously about land back. NICWA is the National Indian Child Welfare Association. So if you want to learn more about ICWA and what you can do nationally, even though we've won a case about it, it's good. Doesn't mean it's not going to be challenged again. So you can educate yourself more about ICWA. The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee is an amazing book by David Troyer that I also recommend. David Troyer is Ojibwe. And then if you like podcasts and you want to learn more about the American Indian movement, Revolutionary Left has a podcast about the American Indian movement. It's 2 hours long. So just make sure you have some time. Maybe you're going on a road trip or, what have you. But those are definitely some things that I recommend. And before we move to Q&A, which if you have any questions, you go ahead, put them in the chat or the Q&A section. But I do want to thank you for spending some of your evening with me tonight during Native American Heritage Month. Maybe you learned something you didn't know before. Maybe you learned Indigenous people still exist. And I don't say that jokingly. There are a lot of people who don't realize Indigenous people are still here. So maybe you learned that we're still here. And maybe you learned maybe something else and you're going to take that knowledge and then hopefully go share it with somebody else. And I do want to thank the Traverse Area Library for having me again. And hopefully, this isn't the last. Maybe, you know, I live in Michigan now. Maybe we do something in person one time. So thank you guys so much. And with that, I will turn it over to any questions that we might have from anyone. And I just really appreciate you guys and thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you so much. I was having trouble unmuting myself, which is weird on my part. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, please hurry up and type them in your chat or Q&A. I know it's a heavy topic, all of it. It's heartbreaking also, but it's very, very important. I was going to ask you what books can. I'm so glad you had that slide up there because I know we have several of those books, especially Lakota Woman. I didn't have a chance to look up the other ones, but I feel like the Indigenous people's history of the United States. I think we have that one too at our library.
Heartbeat of
Double
Wounded
check.
was the other one. Yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, we could definitely get them from other libraries. Pretty wide open in Michigan to be able to borrow back and forth. So, and in other places in the country, which is really good. I think in March we talked about the TV series Alaska Daily that was on that talked about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And that has since canceled, which is a bummer because I thought it was good and I thought it got the awareness out there as well. So I'm kind of bummed and not surprised that it was canceled. Also since then, 1923, which is an offshoot of Yellowstone.
The Yellowstone series, yeah.
Yeah, that was brutal, but I bet you it was pretty accurate, the boarding school part of it. It's very I had a really hard time watching it, but I did because I felt that it was probably accurate. I'm sure it was accurate.
Yeah, so you know, full disclosure, my guilty pleasure is like the whole Yellowstone series and their offshoots. Oh, I don't know why I watch them, but I do. And I'm very glad that the actors and writers are like not on strike anymore. So maybe we can get the rest of it. But yeah, so when 1923 did come out, I was not at all prepared for the portrayal of boarding schools to even be in this series. Like I figured obviously they were going to touch on some indigeneity within it because they have been touched on it the whole time through all of the series. And so when the first scene came up where there was the introduction of the boarding schools, it was very hard to watch. Very hard to watch knowing that I maybe, you know, had ancestors that had to deal with that, and I was fully not prepared. I did, you know, read a little bit more about the portrayal, like how they portrayed it, and they did have Indigenous consultants who were working on that. So what we were getting was a pretty accurate portrayal of how that particular boarding school was, and that was some of the behavior that you could be guaranteed to see across a lot of boarding schools. And that one, the one that's portrayed in the show, is a religiously run boarding school. And I feel like those were maybe more exceptionally harsh than others.
Yeah, definitely. I was trying to think of some good do you have some native fiction authors that you absolutely love?
Fiction authors, yeah, I like oh gosh, what is her name? My bookshelf's right here, so I can look. Louise Edrich is really good. I like the poetry of Joy Harjo. Her poetry is amazing. One of my favorite independent bookstores. So if you want to order said books is Birch Bark Books. They're based in Minneapolis. It's native owned. And they carry a plethora of fiction, nonfiction, history, children's books as well. And so it it's an amazing resource. They're in Minneapolis, but they ship. And when I used to work at a native library, when I used to run a native library, we actually ordered a lot of our books from them. And so I still for gifts will order books from there because they also have like cute little like hats and bags and stuff like that. But it's an amazing bookstore to get it, and they have a plethora of fiction and nonfiction books there too that all deal with Indigenous histories, Indigenous stories, and things like that.
Nice. You and I were talking about earlier beforehand about the Great Michigan Read this year, if others didn't know, is Firekeeper's Daughter by, and I don't want to say her name wrong, but I think it's Angeline Boulay or Booley.
I think you're saying it right.
And it was a fantastic book. It wasn't as harsh as some things, and I expected it to be a little bit more. But it was a really good read, and I think it was very informative as well about native it's a lot about drug use or drugs coming to the community, that kind of thing. And murder and missing and just everything. It's just heartbreaking. But that's a good one that I think people should probably read this year, because there's going to be a lot of discussions on it, since it is a Great Michigan Read, or local libraries and everywhere around the state will be talking about it as well.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely, I said earlier, it's on the bookshelf. I just haven't gotten to it yet. Another book that I would recommend too that just came out is The Rediscovery of America by Ned Blackhawk. I think he's a professor at Yale, I think. But that just came out, and of course I just bought that one. I'll probably like devour that one, but it's not a read it's a retelling of US history, but weaving in that indigenous narrative, and he looks and analyzes things that maybe we hadn't really thought about before, and so I'm very excited to dive into that one. And then another good one is also 1491, um which is so Rediscovery of America and 1491 are more adult based, but yeah, very very good books to get out there right now. There's a lot of great reading out there by Indigenous authors or even non-native authors who are writing about Indigenous, things. Like Killers of the Flower Moon was really good. So there's a lot of um work out there that's really talking about indigeneity and what it means to be Indigenous and our history. And I think that's great.
Yeah, me too. Because maybe, I don't even know, as long as 15 years ago, you didn't hear as much about it. And
Absolutely.
it's definitely, people are becoming more aware, and I think they should be.
Yeah,
Thank you so much
100%.
for coming. Yeah, thank you so much for coming again. We would love to have you in person sometime, so we'll keep in touch for sure. I don't
For
see that
sure.
anyone, I don't see that anyone has any questions, and I know it's hard. Plus, you just want to listen. But she put up her email and stuff. If you think of anything later, you can also email us at ask@tattle.org, and we can pass on that information to her too, and she'll get back to you. But thank you everyone for coming tonight, and thank you again, Heather, for spending your evening with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening, and I hope you take one thing that you learned tonight and pass it on to someone else.
Oh, there might be one thing in chat. Let's see. Oh, thank you. Thank you too.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Bye.